Mr. Ezendu is at a critical stage of his life, trapped down by a terminal ailment, which according to the doctors may claim his life in 60 days, except a prescribed medical procedure is undergone. The medical procedure is estimated to cost a fortune. Mrs. Ezendu, on the other hand, can barely eat or do anything at all, knowing fully well that her husband is seriously sick and needs to undergo a medical procedure whose cost is way above anything they could possibly raise in their entire life. She goes to bed every night crying, praying to God and hoping for a miracle to happen. But reverse is the case, as the husband's condition keeps deteriorating with each day that passes. They've exhausted every means possible to raise funds. They've consulted friends, family and well-wishers, but all they could raise was so insignificant to the sum needed. The days turned into nights and the nights back to days, and in less than a blink, it was already 10 days to the death day of Mr. Ezendu as stated by the doctor. And at this point, Mr. Ezendu is totally confined to his sick bed. He could barely move or talk. Mrs. Ezendu, on the other hand, has lost every sense of hope, knowing that she has exhausted every means possible to raise money, well except one. A week earlier, Mrs. Ezendu had approached Mr. Felix for a loan to offset her husband's medical bill. Mr. Felix is a business tycoon who had on several occasions declared his sexual attraction towards Mrs. Ezendu, and on every occasion, she had rebuked him, pointing to the fact that she is a married woman and cannot commit such atrocity. On that fateful day, Mr. Felix had refused to grant her the loan. Instead, he offered to gift her the entire money for the treatment, if and only if she allowed him have a taste of her honeypot. But as usual, she vehemently refused and walked away. Now, considering the fact that her husband was just 10 days away from giving up the ghost, she had resolved within herself to accept Mr. Felix's offer. After all, it was going to be a one-time thing, and her husband was going to be well again. Long story short, Mrs. Ezendu granted Mr. Felix access to her honeypot, and in turn, Mr. Felix paid for the entire medical bills of her husband. Hence, the medical procedure was done. Weeks later, Mr. Ezendu had tremendously recovered, thanking his wife for sticking with him through such difficult time and finding a way to make sure the medical procedure happens, therefore restoring his health. But then he stopped for a second to ask how she managed to come up with such amount of money for his medical bills. Mrs. Ezendu, being the good woman that she was, didn't want to lie to her husband, so with a heavy heart and eyes filled with tears, she opened her mouth to tell her husband nothing but the truth. On hearing the truth, Mr. Ezendu was shocked and speechless. His wife is his most prized jewel. Even though he is poor, nature has however blessed him with such an epitome of beauty and virtuousness as a wife. Now, having his head all clouded with the thought of another man touching his most precious jewel got him tearing like a boy. After a long period of silence, Mr. Ezendu altered to his wife, "You should have allowed me to die." Mrs. Ezendu, on hearing this, cried even more profusely, stating how much she loves her husband and couldn't have allowed him to die. After some talking and emotional moments, Mr. Ezendu came to a conclusion that the marriage was over. Mrs. Ezendu was sent packing, and indeed the marriage was over. For the men, what would you have done in such situation? Would you have taken a different decision? And for the ladies, do you think that Mrs. Ezendu was wrongly treated for saving her husband's life? Personally, I think that men generally lacks the ability to forgive a cheating woman. But this, however, is a delicate situation, so kindly leave us comments of your thoughts.